my story kind of starts way back in the early 90s, really, when I travelled to Africa for the first time, and I met there a Swiss nature photographer called Karl Ammann. His name probably doesn't mean a great deal to you, but he went on to do a great deal of work, very positive work, on the bushmeat trade. And one night around the campfire, Karl told me stories of close encounters with lions, with elephants, with herds of wildebeest 1 million strong. But he also told me of his almost compulsive obsession to do something for Africa, the land that he loved, to protect Africa. And it sounds a little bit melodramatic, if I'm honest, but the fire in Karl's eyes that night changed my life forever. I've got to admit that for the first part of what is loosely referred to as my photographic career, I was a little bit of a trophy hunter, with a camera, of course. I travelled the world in search of those blue chip species, if you like, those species that would adorn the front cover of magazines or calendars. And if I'm honest, it was great fun, especially when those nice people at the picture agencies sent me a big fat cheque for doing what was little more than larking around, if truth be told. But then, around the turn of the millennium, two things happened. Firstly, I realised that I was failing spectacularly to do something. I yearned to make a difference, and I was making none. Secondly, some bright spark invented the digital camera, which overnight revolutionised nature photography. It brought on board, it opened the floodgates really to an army of young, hungry, tech-savvy photographers who effectively flooded the market, all searching for their own trophies and holding them up to show the world. And very, very quickly, the laws of supply and demand kicked in, and those images of golden eagles, lynx, red squirrels, brown bears, whatever, became almost worthless. And so I effectively retired as a nature photographer probably about 15 years ago now, and after a very short career, and set up as a photographic communicator, a visual storyteller. Now, I'm aware that that sounds nauseatingly pretentious, and it really shouldn't, because I simply realised that as a society, as a culture, as a species even, we're hardwired to absorb stories, written stories, verbal stories, musical stories, movie stories, photographic stories. And so it was obvious to me that in an industry that had become excruciatingly competitive almost overnight, and with a deep yearning within myself to do something, I needed to change tack. And that's kind of how I got into wildlife storytelling. So this was my first foray, if you like, into a new venture. This is a project called Tooth and Claw that I worked on for about 3 years with a friend of mine, Mark Hamblin. And we spent 3 years exploring people's attitudes towards predators. We interviewed hundreds of people, scientists, researchers, farmers, gamekeepers, tourism operators, and just everyday folk, really, about their often illogical and irrational and inconsistent perception of predators, and perhaps what those attitudes tell us about our relationship with nature as a whole. Now, as you probably imagine, this started off effectively as a wildlife photography project, but it very quickly morphed into a project about people, about us, and more specifically, about our values, our belief systems. Working on Tooth and Claw, it taught me a great deal about predators, about predator-prey interactions, but perhaps more than anything, it taught me a great deal about my own species, and I suppose what motivates individuals to think what they think, to say what they say, to do what they do. So that journey, learning about people's moral values, people's belief systems, was an exciting one, an insightful one, and has stood me in good stead, I think, ever since. Post Tooth and Claw, I worked on a project called Highland Tiger. Now, this was the first serious attempt by a group of conservation bodies and public agencies to try and stop the Scottish wildcat going to extinction, and it really was that desperate, it really is that desperate. Part of the wildcat's problems stem from the fact that very few people ever see one. Lots of people don't even know that they exist. And so part of wildcat conservation is getting this iconic creature up there into the public consciousness, getting it up there with other celebrities, if you will, of the wildlife world, ospreys, otters, sea eagles, red squirrels, etc. I believe it's virtually impossible to ask people to care about something with which they have no connection. And so understanding and tapping into people's values to make that connection, to bridge that connection, is, I believe, at the heart of effective conservation communication. I can't remember who said this or where I read it, but some years ago, somebody said that people's relationship with nature, it's not logical or rational. It certainly isn't scientific. For the most part, people's relationship with nature is emotional. And I don't know if there are any scientists or academics in this room, but no doubt that saying such things makes me a heretic. But it is true. Most of what people think and feel about nature is based on their moral values, and that in turn is influenced by emotion. And so, as conservation communicators, I think we should accept it, recognise it, and have no hesitation in exploiting that fact. For about 5 years, I spent quite a lot of time travelling, not necessarily to long-haul destinations, but throughout Europe and across the UK, working on two major conservation photography projects. One was called Wild Wonders of Europe, and the other was called 2020 Vision. And I'd like to think that during that time, those projects did something. They made a difference. But I've got to be honest, during that whole process, I just felt instinctively there was something missing. So about 3 years ago, I think, I sat down and asked myself a few basic questions. What is it that really fires me up? Where is it that I can work most effectively? And how can I best make a difference? Rewilding fires me up. Restoring and reconnecting our broken landscapes, allowing natural processes to fuel and revitalise habitats and species. Chris Packham said recently, there's a real case for listening to ecologists rather than always the case for economists, and I agree with him completely. I consider rewilding to be not only an ecological obligation, but a moral one too. Where can I work most effectively? Well, close to home, where I know the lie of the land, physically, of course, but also culturally, even politically. And there's no doubt that Scotland is a spectacular country. We saw that last night in Highlands. But it does fall short, way short, of its full ecological potential that I think could benefit people as well as a whole suite of other species. And how can I make a difference? How can I do something? Well, by telling stories, working with other media professionals across a wide range of media platforms, books, films, essays, magazine features, etc., to tell stories, inspiring, informative, and compelling stories. And that kind of brings me to this project, Scotland, the Big Picture, which in a way brings me full circle to back where I started. And it draws together all the lessons, the mistakes I've made, the lessons I've learned, the experiences I've had over the last 20 years. The Big Picture allows me to work close to home for prolonged periods on stories that matter to me personally and that I hope will resonate with other people too. And it kind of started about 3 years ago, looking out over this well-known viewpoint. This is Stack Polly in Assynt, of course. And I was up there on a cold, windy day, as you can see. And so I was surprised, actually, to meet another photographer, a young Polish lad, who had followed me up there. And we stood out looking over this scene, and he said to me, you know, what is it we're looking at? What is it? How am I going to caption my picture? So I pointed out to him the peaks, Culmore, Kilbeg, Caniff, Sullivan, and of course down below us was Inverpolly Forest. And I knew, as soon as I said that, I knew I was in trouble. Forest, he said, where the hell are the trees? Not one tree to be seen. And I kind of then started to have to disentangle the context of deer forests, because of course deer forests in Scotland have no trees, they're hunting grounds. And this Polish guy who comes from a well-wooded continental country had no concept of this whatsoever. He couldn't get his head around it. No matter how I tried to explain it, straight over his head. So I suppose the cultural complexities of Highland deer forests kind of lit the blue touch paper on this project. The idealised Scottish landscape, which the tourist brochures celebrate, is an ecological shadow of its former self. I've stood at places like the Kerrang on Skye and other iconic viewpoints and listened to people marvel at the view in front of them. This, for many people, is what Scotland looks like. It's what Scotland should look like. But in many ways, if we're honest, it's a museum piece. It's a geological wonder surrounded by an ecological desert, devoid of the natural woodlands that would once have cloaked those slopes, devoid of the myriad species that, given the chance, would fuel the processes of birth, death, decay, and regeneration, processes that are not there right now, and devoid, perhaps, as a landscape, of hope. This, for me, is a landscape devoid of hope. No rewilding, just constant, incessant de-wilding. Now, it's not all bad news, and we need, of course we do, we need positive, uplifting stories every bit as much as we need as the sort of debilitating, soul-sapping narratives that perhaps the conservation community has historically peddled. Ospreys, of course, are a good news story. They're back in business, as are red kites, sea eagles, otters, hopefully beavers. Elsewhere in Scotland, we have a growing number of private estates, like here in Glenfeshie, where business money, commerce, is being used to revitalise whole landscapes and to pioneer restoration techniques in the Highlands, in the uplands. Elsewhere, we've got a number of NGO and public land holdings, places like Glenafric, Benay, Craigmeggy, Abernethy, that are slowly but slowly coming back to life after years of kind of not performing as they might. Species like pine martens are finding their way back. Red squirrels are finding their way back to places where, in some cases, unbelievably perhaps for many of us, they've not been seen for decades. And sometimes, in darkened rooms, in hushed conversations, there's talk of the return of lynx. But it is only talk for now. So, my hope in the long term is that the big picture its stories will contribute, it will play a part alongside other media platforms in amplifying and articulating the case for a wilder Scotland. And as storytellers, as communicators, simply as citizens that are concerned, and I'm sure we all are here, for the future of the natural world, we need stories. We need to tell those stories. Yes, those stories need to be informative, inspiring. They probably need to be fair and measured. But increasingly, I think they need to be bold and brave. Because whether we like it or not, it is people who hold the key to the rewilding door. It's people who hold the key to the climate change door and the human population door, these big, big, big challenges of our time. It is people who will decide what Scotland looks like 200 years from now. And so our stories, our collective stories, in all their manifestations, they need to get inside people's heads. They need to get inside people's hearts, tap into their belief systems, and ultimately, hopefully, inspire them to do something. Thank you.